Welcome back to the channel. In this video we're going to look at the infighting from the Crawford vs. Spence fight. This fight makes for an interesting infighting film study because we see Spence repeatedly try to get inside using the same step jab plus overhand left combo, and Crawford was using both the high guard and the Philly shell throughout the fight. This means we can see how Spence's infighting tactics fare differently against each stance, and the step jab plus overhand left combo in particular. Let's start off with an overview of Spence's infighting stance.
Started this third round, it was a beautiful.
In his typical stance, Spence keeps his rear foot sideways. This keeps his hips and torso sideways, which forces him to keep his rear foot almost directly behind his lead foot. This leaves him with a narrow base, making it harder to stay balanced after pivoting on his overhand left. Before punching, his torso is sideways and weight is evenly distributed. After punching, his torso is squared, weight is front foot heavy. Committing to power on his overhand left often forces his rear leg to swing out wide to recover his balance. Swinging the rear foot out wide after stepping in on a rear hand punch is a common way to transition to this stance on the inside. I refer to Spence's wider, front foot heavy stance here as head to chest, since the bend in his knees and the forward lean of his torso puts his head at Crawford's chest level. From this stance, Spence can push off his back foot to apply pushing pressure with his head, gloves, and arms into Crawford's chest, jaw, neck, shoulder, collarbone, or high guard. From this stance at close range, he can target the head and body on both sides and around the guard. Once here, Spence would attack with combos, often targeting the body with hooks. Here's another example of the step jab plus overhand left where we can see the footwork.
The vacant ring welterweight title.
Unlike the last example, Crawford was not trapped on the ropes, so he could make space after Spence's attack. Stepping back was one of Crawford's main tactics to prevent Spence from getting inside for head to chest, mainly in the first few rounds, but this led to him getting put on the ropes more often.
The only man.
Most of the time after Spence got inside, Crawford was able to shut down his offense with clinching and footwork, but there were times when Spence was able to get inside to head to chest and throw punches. Let's start with a few examples of when Spence got head to chest and how it differed based on Crawford's stance. Spence's step jab plus overhand left to get inside was by far his most frequently thrown combination. This is a sign that it served a strategic purpose other than just landing punches, since using the same combination over and over to land punches would be far too predictable against most opponents, let alone a great counterpuncher like Crawford. As we just saw, that purpose was to get inside for a head to chest position, particularly when Crawford was in a high guard.
Third step jab to the body by Spence.
Spence's overhand left makes contact while Crawford is stepping over. With one foot off the ground, the impact breaks Crawford's posture, freezing him in place. Even if his overhand left doesn't penetrate the guard, being able to load up on a big punch and make contact with the guard gives Spence a way to keep Crawford in front of him to try and get in to head to chest.
Upstairs by Crawford.
When under pressure, Crawford often circled or pivoted right to align himself to Spence's centerline. Staying mobile also limited Spence's ability to set his feet to generate power and kept Crawford off the ropes. So while Crawford was able to circle around while taking shots on his guard, they affected his balance enough that he couldn't counter.
Overhand left curls behind the guard of Crawford, and then Spence splits the guard of Crawford. It's the first round, but it's been all Crawford ever since.
And this is why no welterweight that has faced Terence Crawford has ended up going the distance.
More so than Crawford.
Attacking the body here helps position Spence's arm to get an underhook and keep Crawford from escaping out to that side.
Team combination punches per round, according to
Spence tries to apply head and shoulder pressure while stepping his feet back to make space to punch. Crawford shuts him down both times he tries this by stepping his left foot in to close the hip space while maintaining the right overhook.
show stats for Spence. Spence normally averages 34.
Started this third round, it was a beautiful overhand left that landed on
There's another
Crawford.
one, and now Spence going to the body.
Here we see one of the risks of the head to chest position. With his head low and forward, Spence can't see Crawford's right hook coming. The safety of the head to chest stance comes from maintaining body contact with Crawford before pulling back to punch. Here Spence has just slipped right but hasn't taken that space away before coming back up, so Crawford can still punch. This is why I think it's helpful to differentiate between infighting range, or being on the inside, where you're pressing into the opponent's body in some way, and close range, where you're very close to the opponent but there's still space between you. A fighter like Crawford that can tighten up the trajectory of his punches in close range is a good example of why being aware of the difference is important.
Crawford fighting back, but he gets jolted.
When Crawford was in a high guard, it was easier for Spence to quickly trap his gloves, letting him set up attacks.
But
Even
the jab from Crawford,
exactly.
even the jab is a power.
The jab is a
Landing 38% jabs. I mean, and they're power jabs. They're not just.
There's a right hand left by Spence.
Next, let's look at when Spence gets head to chest when Crawford is in a Philly shell. With Crawford's torso sideways and his lead hand no longer raised up in the high guard, Spence had trouble landing his overhand left coming in, and his head to chest was less effective.
And on every level.
Crawford steps back before the overhand left. If Crawford was in the high guard, Spence could throw it to where the lead hand was anyway and make contact. But if he falls short here, he knows Crawford is looking to counter. This makes him hesitant to punch on his first step in. He smothers himself and gives Crawford an opening to push him backwards.
And initiating offense.
The 35 step jab.
Not wanting to fall short, Spence smothers himself coming in. Crawford times his torso rotation for the punch. With Crawford's torso sideways, it's harder for Spence to grip his neck for head control. Spence still finds a grip on the tricep with his left glove while trapping with the right glove.
Yeah, that eye's not looking good on Spence right now. I mean, he's got a lot of power.
You bring up a good point here.
Crawford kept his rear glove tight in his guard with the palm open for maximum protection. Unlike the high guard, Spence can't align his head to Crawford's center line when directly in front of him like this. He has to pick a side. Crawford sometimes defended against the rear body hook by turning into it.
Up his right hand when he was fighting in school.
Spence sometimes pressed his head into Crawford's lead shoulder to square his torso up, but Crawford would adjust by pivoting his rear foot back. Spence attacks again, but Crawford has made space, and his bladed stance lets him power punch with his rear hand in close range.
Started practicing more on his left.
When Spence leaned over his front foot trying to apply head pressure, Crawford often threw the rear uppercut.
His left became stronger than his right body, and that difference in hand displayed the accuracy, the explosiveness, the body movement.
With Spence front foot heavy, Crawford would also push with a horizontal lead forearm frame into Spence's center line.
Forward, trying to. Oh,
Again, the reason.
A natural counter to the Philly shell in close range is to take advantage of the low lead hand by attacking over the shoulder. At long range and mid range, the Philly shell fighter can lean back to avoid the rear hand or deflect it with their shoulder. But in close range, their head can still be reached after they lean back. As we saw, Spence smothered himself trying to land the overhand left coming in, so he was also trying to land it by getting inside first, then making space for it. Spence sets up his chopping cross over the shoulder by standing Crawford up tall using his horizontal lead forearm frame.
Is so effective and so hard is because he's
Close to being over, I believe.
Crawford in a high guard, Spence head to chest on the center line. After punching, Spence presses into Crawford's lead shoulder. Crawford brings his lead arm down for the Philly shell. The head pressure keeps Crawford's torso squared up until Crawford pivots back to reset his stance. Spence traps the rear hand to prevent the uppercut and lands an overhand left before Crawford can push him away.
getting the right angle.
In this example, Crawford anticipates Spence's step in for head to chest. He steps back to avoid being smothered, punches around the guard, then pushes with his horizontal lead forearm frame.
The jab by Crawford.
Spence gets front foot heavy. Crawford's lead forearm moves forward to frame. Instead of trying to attack over the shoulder, Spence steps back and tries to place a rear hook behind Crawford's elbow. Crawford reacts by stepping back and countering with a combo.
The difference is hands.
Offense.
The 35-year-old Terence.
Another example of Spence's head pressure squaring Crawford's torso up. In this last example, we see most of the technical details we just looked at in one clip.
We have already reached the midpoint of this champion.
Spence's horizontal lead forearm frame gets Crawford to step over and opens up space for his hook. Now Crawford's horizontal lead forearm frame gets Spence to step over. Spence quickly jabs back in to continue pressuring. Crawford throws the rear uppercut while Spence is front foot heavy. Crawford pivots back to recover his Philly shell, and Spence throws the overhand left over the lead shoulder. Crawford counters with the rear uppercut since Spence is front foot heavy.
Left uppercut on the inside.
A common tactic from the Philly shell is to pull back and bend at the waist, but we didn't see that much from Crawford in this fight. This could be a stylistic choice, but it might also be because Spence was constantly trying to get inside and push forward, and the waist bend leaves Crawford out of position if he can't raise back up quickly enough. There were a few times where Crawford bent at the waist when Spence came in, and Spence used the vertical lead forearm frame to control and set up punches when he did. Spence often threw a lead hook after the vertical lead forearm frame.
Bothered by the offense of Crawford, he said he...
Crawford removes the vertical lead forearm frame by lifting up under the elbow.
Spence trying, but then gets clipped. And we have of this championship fight. It is
This early in the fight and on every level, both countering and...
In the previous examples, we saw Spence transition from the vertical lead forearm frame to the lead hook. He'd sometimes do the reverse, throw the lead hook, then get the vertical lead forearm frame. Spence steps back and throws a tight lead hook aimed for the front of Crawford's face, then the vertical lead forearm frame helps him make space.
Five-year-old Terence "Bud" Crawford.
Compared to the vertical lead forearm frame, Spence's horizontal lead forearm frame is much easier for Crawford to control from this position.
Steve Farhood, Errol Spence.
Lead hook to the front of the face, then vertical lead forearm frame to set up the overhand left. This is a good camera angle to see the different directions each frame is meant to apply pushing pressure into. A horizontal lead forearm frame would push into the center line to force Crawford to step back to recover his balance. The vertical lead forearm frame pushes Crawford onto his back foot or past his back foot, like in this example.
On the scorecards, won the first in round 7. And again, guys, he landed that left and boom!
Spence lands a tight lead hook, then steps in with the vertical lead forearm frame, but Crawford steps back this time. Due to Crawford's step back, Spence's vertical lead forearm frame isn't pressing into Crawford's neck to force him onto his back foot, so Crawford can push it across his body.
By Spence, he's trying his best.
There weren't too many examples of Spence clinch walking, probably because it relied on Spence jabbing in and his jab was getting countered often, or because he was getting turned shortly after he started to clinch walk.
Dealer, another M&M reference for Terence Crawford in the second round.
Even though he got turned, by continuing to fight for position, he ends up in a better stance than Crawford and can clinch walk away from the ropes.
Definitely woke him up. He's a lot more aggressive.
Excellent advice to their...
Spence step jabs, then steps in underhooks. With a T position and lower center of gravity, Spence can clinch walk Crawford back to the ropes.
And this round,
place he has to really work.
Spence's lead foot steps back into a shuffle. This baits Crawford into stepping in to attack the shuffle. Spence anticipates this and uses it to help him close the distance. He step jabs, then steps in underhooks.
See it? There it is there.
There were two situations where Crawford turned Spence, when Spence was slipping in and when they were already in the clinch. The examples where Crawford turned Spence in the clinch, he uses Spence's forward momentum against him by turning him with footwork before Spence has set his feet after coming in. With a rear overhook, Crawford pivots on his lead foot, then steps and pivots his lead foot, then steps his rear foot back.
Excellent advice to their warriors.
Where he's about to touch the ropes, Crawford swings his left foot back, pivoting on his right foot, the southpaw lead foot, which stays planted. Once his rear foot plants, his lead foot steps and pivots. Then his rear foot steps back to complete the turn.
Crawford steps it up a little bit more.
Most experts thought this would be an evenly contested.
Crawford's rear foot begins pivoting back immediately before Spence's lead foot has landed. Lead foot steps and pivots. Rear foot steps back.
Disputed champion in a second weight class, Clarissa Shield.
In addition to using Spence's forward momentum, Crawford is able to turn Spence because he gets good leverage on the overhook. When pulling on an overhook, you get more leverage when the arm is extended away from their body.
Feet on the female side and double jab. Dictate.
This is a good camera angle to see how easily Spence gets turned while he's leaning forward with his overhooked arm extended.
Of this fight. Spence continues to go to...
This last clip is the only example where Crawford pushes into Spence with the lead underhook to turn him, and it's because he was against the ropes.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know...
After blocking the hook, Crawford steps his right foot out wide to get low and pushes off of it to clinch up. He quickly pivots to turn Spence onto the ropes.
There's Spence going downstairs to the body. Spence normally...
Sometimes Spence tried to slip in for head to chest when Crawford started punching, but getting too front foot heavy made him susceptible to being turned. After punching, Crawford's hands and forearms were in position to turn Spence by pushing on his head or behind his elbows and stepping over.
Dealer, another M&M reference for Terence Crawford.
Too much forward lean from Spence here. Keeping a high guard here to try and raise up into head to chest instead of going for an underhook gives Crawford a grip behind his elbow.
Yeah, that definitely woke him up. He's a lot more aggressive.
Delivered punch up. And all of these shots.
Another tactic we saw from Crawford was to hide his head in the clinch to protect himself from the rear hand. One way Spence tried to fight against the Philly shell on the inside was to get a lead underhook, use it to help square himself up to Crawford, then push for space and punch. When Crawford got the rear overhook, he would hide his head behind Spence's shoulder to protect it from potential hooks from Spence's rear hand. He would also use the overhook to turn Spence, which prevented him from setting his feet and helped Crawford recover his Philly shell. steps in and underhooks. They aren't fully squared up, but it's enough for Spence to work with. He tries to push Crawford back, but Crawford pushes back in response and hides his head.
On display.
For sure from Crawford and everything.
Disputed champion in a second weight class.
Spence steps in deep by double jabbing, then underhooks.
Clarissa Shield.
The deep step in would help square him up to Crawford once his rear foot steps in. From there, he could push for space and punch. However, Crawford turns him first.
Has achieved.
His head stays tucked as he completes the turn. Just as the ref intervenes, they're squared up enough that Spence tries to bring his head down for head to chest, and Crawford counters this by pushing him backwards.
A lot more.
Terence Crawford is landing 50.
With the head hidden, Spence attacks the body instead, then swings his left forearm around for bicep control. Now they're squared up with space between them. Spence steps back and pushes for space, but Crawford turns his lead shoulder in, bends down, and steps in to smother. Getting bumped back creates space, so Spence leans in for head to chest. Crawford presses with his lead forearm to keep Spence's gloves trapped and steps back.
Jab. That's a
Digging to the body. You're right, Abner.
Anticipating the body hook, Crawford pulls his lead arm in tight to block the punch.
How about that, do you not, sir?
Crawford pushes after squaring up.
Two detached red.
He's deadly either way he goes.
You know, people may say, gosh, why is Spence concentrating so much on the...
After getting jabbed onto his back foot, Spence slips down and steps in for an underhook, so Crawford hides his head.
Double jab.
They're squared up enough that Spence tries to make space by stepping back.
Dictating
But the overhook gives Crawford the leverage to turn him.
the pace of this fight.
Another tactic from Crawford was his lead hand control after throwing a combination. He repeatedly took advantage of Spence's tendency to slip down after his first punch landed. He would put a short combo together, then push or frame, preventing a potential response. By pushing Spence past his base to either side, he was also taking advantage of the narrowness of Spence's stance. Slipping or waist bending after pulling back put Spence heavy on his back foot and susceptible to being framed. We also see Crawford get head control when Spence slips down after his rear hooks.
From Terence Bud Crawford.
The torso rotation on his cross puts Crawford's lead forearm in position to frame on Spence's neck. Crawford would sometimes target the body with rear hooks when Spence raised up from the bottom of his slip, as he does here instead of framing.
He knocked down Errol Spence. The right hand from Crawford. Spence walks in. He's met with highly...
He pulls down on Spence's neck after his rear hook goes past the head. Along with the head control, he shifts his lead foot back to a shuffle stance. He switches to the vertical lead forearm frame and shuffles away.
You know, Terence Crawford's a really good...
Right now that he's putting.
And Crawford is putting the punches.
Counter punch.
In addition to pulling back intentionally, Spence also sometimes got forced onto his back foot due to how narrow his base was in his sideways stance. When one foot was off the ground while stepping in, the force of a jab would knock his head back. He commits to his step and roll onto his front foot. Crawford throws a second jab instead of a rear hand punch, which means no torso rotation and no lead forearm in position to immediately frame and keep Spence on his back foot. Spence's step and roll squares them up. Crawford can't get enough leverage with his forearm frame to prevent Spence from raising back up, but the ref intervenes.
He's keeping his right glove up. 28, so it has...
The body shots of Crawford.
Another example of Crawford shifting his lead foot back to a shuffle after head control.
Crawford has the fourth. That
Crawford gets head control after the rear hook, shuffles back, then throws a lead hook.
Continues to pop. Spence's head back to right. I mean, being hit by the jab is.
After missing the overhand left, Spence falls forward with his head past his base. Crawford immediately takes advantage by shuffling backwards and pushing Spence to line him up for the lead body hook. This is the same position as when he has head control after a rear hook. He then steps his lead foot back to a squared stance to make space for a rear body hook.
This fight is very...
Next we'll look at Crawford pushing off when Spence is front foot heavy. The first two examples we'll look at are related to the last section, where Crawford throws a rear hand punch, then gets a vertical lead forearm frame, while Spence is heavy on his back foot and past his base. The difference is that in these examples, Spence gets front foot heavy before he can frame, so he immediately pushes off to help himself step back. Crawford uses the vertical lead forearm frame to help push off when Spence tries to get back in front of him.
Meanwhile, the countering.
In the next examples, the main difference is that Crawford's lead forearm was in his high guard when Spence gets front foot heavy, so it ends up on the right side of Spence's face instead of the vertical lead forearm frame, which frames into the neck on the left side.
The footwork from Crawford in the openings.
Crawford pushes off his rear foot to step his lead foot back, since he's pushing off with his lead hand.
Hand and the left. It's a palpable chip on his shoulder. He'll find critics, but none exist.
It's exactly that. The accuracy, the from
In this last clip, we see both types of pushes.
Other one, and now Spence going to the body.
After his lead hook, Crawford pushes with the horizontal lead forearm frame on the right side of Spence's guard.
Both of these guys are dogs in that ring.
With the horizontal lead forearm frame on the left side of Spence's head against his neck, Crawford pushes him straight back. The last tactic we'll look at is how Crawford pushed Spence backwards. So one of the ways a pressure fighter can apply pressure is by keeping their opponent on the back foot, forcing them to back up with constant punching and pushing pressure. We've already seen how Crawford avoided getting backed up by turning Spence and circling around him in his high guard in close range. Another way he avoided getting backed up was to push Spence back first. Crawford pushed Spence back in two ways, using his arms and using his legs. Both occurred when Spence got inside and Crawford was in the Philly shell. He would push into Spence's chest. He did this when Spence was aligned directly in front of him. One reason Crawford is able to do this is that he isn't getting hit by Spence's jab when he jabs in. The frontal push with the arms is usually good for pushing an opponent back 6 to 12 inches or so, but it did prevent Spence from setting his feet in that moment and forced him to have to get inside again.
Spence, there's a jab from Crawford that lands.
Crawford. Nice counter right hand a moment.
From Crawford. Every punch that
Spence is beginning to feel the same way.
And even showing the creativity there to go downstairs as well.
he has ever by Crawford.
Those punches.
Now Crawford, beautiful jab to the body.
When in his Philly shell, Crawford also backs Spence off by pushing off his back foot through his lead shoulder into Spence's chest. In some examples, Crawford would inside pivot first to recover his Philly shell and angle his push into Spence's centerline. The more Spence squared up after his overhand left, the easier it was for Crawford to immediately push into his centerline.
It's every time that Spence takes that step back.
Slightly squared up, Crawford adjusts his stance using the pivot footwork we've looked at before. From here, he can push off his back foot through his lead shoulder into Spence's chest.
And when he's done it, it's
the accuracy and the
this early in the fight and on every level, both offense.
The 35-year-old Terence jab.
yeah.
You always see Spence counter this tactic by stepping both feet back to create space while trapping with his lead hand and applying head pressure. Having created space between his chest and Crawford's lead shoulder, Spence sets up his overhand left by stepping his lead foot out wide and slipping laterally.
He's not
Spence
forgetting
trying to dig
that
deep, though.
I mean, he's got a
Yeah,
lot
you
of
bring
power.
up a good point. He actually messed up his right hand. School, and he started practicing more on his left, and he says his left became stronger than his right. A huge.
The overhand left misses and Crawford begins to push. Spence recovers his stance and applies head pressure into the lead shoulder. The head pressure squares Crawford's torso up for a moment, but he quickly turns in and starts pivoting.
7th round for Terence
Now the angle is good enough to start pushing Spence back.
Crawford. The 2 knockdowns, also the 1 knockdown in the second. Crawford gave Spence.
Alright, and that brings us to the end of the film study. Thanks for watching.